So this is Lucy Sullivan interviewing Maxine Wilson Young on January 12, 2012. Okay, Maxine, name where and when you received your credentials and where do you currently work?
Okay, I trained at the University of Iowa, and at that point in time with ABRET, it required 2 years experience after your training, which was 1 year. So I started training in '66, and I got my REEGT in 1969. It always was kind of a comical pet peeve of mine that the rules changed when I was at the point of having achieved my 2 years. So students that I worked with took this exams at the same time I did. But that did mean that we were able to do a lot of studying together. I also achieved Canadian registration when I chose to move to Canada, so I have both REEGT and the Canadian RET.
Did you find those exams to be pretty comparable?
I liked the format. I'll have to admit, I don't remember my first ABRET exam, except that I thought the questions were very clear. It was a decade or so later that I took the Canadian. The Canadian's only 100 questions, so each one has more value. I did retake the ABRET exam when you could do it just kind of for your own information, and I found having more questions gave me a greater sense of confidence of, oh, that one's easy, that one's easy, that one's easy, and then you focus down on the more complex questions. So I guess my preference is for the ABRET style, but they are reasonably comparable.
Great. I was just curious about that, you know. What drew you to EEG and diagnostics?
It was really just a fluke. I was in a 2-year training program as a medical secretary, and the training program at the University of Iowa sent out one flyer to every junior college in the United States. And at Spokane Community College, Spokane, Washington, where I was training, the only medical things at the junior college was a 2-year medical secretary program, a dental technician program, and a licensed practical nursing course. And that one flyer got sent to the nurse who taught medical secretary. I quite liked all my medical courses, terminology and anatomy and physiology and that sort of thing. The secretarial skills of old-fashioned shorthand and typing were a little less to my liking, and so the flyer ended up on my desk. And I liked the fact that I liked the problem-solving aspect that this is just reading a description, but I wanted to do something more than record someone else's actions on behalf of a patient, so I applied, and I think it was the fact they said they'd give preference to people with physiology and biology, and so I'd had some of that, and I actually took some junior college courses in biology, hoping to make myself a more attractive candidate, and I was successful, being one of 8 students for the first class at the University of Iowa. I graduated on Friday night from my 2-year medical secretary class, flew to Iowa, and started class the next Monday in EEG. My roommate at the time had to learn a little bit of shorthand because I would often take some of my notes in shorthand. So my medical secretary training did have some advantages to me over and above the anatomy and physiology classes I'd taken.
No doubt. Was EEG a specialty when you were starting your career? Was it popular?
I would say it was virtually unknown. My mother did recall seeing EEG reports in patients' charts. She was a nurse anesthetist and would review patients' charts before she dealt with it in the OR. But I had had no personal experience with EEG and didn't know anyone that had had an EEG. So I really was going into a brand new adventure. But the fact that it was medically based on anatomy and physiology, it wasn't, a magical, it wasn't presented as a magical medical miracle. It was a down-to-earth practical application. Made me think I might be getting started in a good line of work. And when people ask me how long I've been in EEG, I'll say, a few years. And if they say, why? I said, well, because you're part of a team. The physician doesn't see anything I haven't seen first, and my job is to make the physician's job easier and doing everything now that I think the physician might think later, gee, I wish there were iLeads, or back before we had digital, I'd like to see that on a CZ reference montage, or, gee, that would be better if we did this. And I can recall students saying, you must be a mind reader because he's reading records with us as a new group of students. And he says, I'd like to see the transverse montage now. And they said, and in 2 pages, there it was. So I liked that aspect of it. And that aspect still exists.
No doubt. Exactly. Who were your early mentors?
That would have to be John Knott and Lila Snodgrass. They were the key people in the program at the University of Iowa. There were Gil Frank, who's no longer with us. He was a younger neurologist, and he was involved in working with the second class at the University of Iowa, and he had some innovative ways of getting people to think about things. And so as a first-year student graduate, he would sometimes bounce things off of me, and I'm sitting there scratching my head and thinking, oh, I'd never thought about it that way. Similarly, Dr. Jun Kimura, who is better known in EMG now, but he took his EEG boards while he was at the University of Iowa, and over and above reading records, he would come in one day a week and actually apply electrodes and run an EEG prior to his EEG boards. And that always made me regard him very highly, because he got down to the very beginning of how you approach the patient and how you apply electrodes and how you get the patient's cooperation. And I think he fully participated in the appreciation of the EEGer. I'm wording that poorly. His appreciation of what the tech contributed to the overall EEG that he ultimately would read. Over the years, there have been a lot of people who've contributed. Chuck Henry would often visit the University of Iowa lab, and he would pose good problems and relate stories that the things that his techs had done, and it just made you appreciate that there wasn't a single way of doing an EEG, that it was an active process that the tech should be involved in. And it wasn't in what order you ran the montages, but based on what you see, what would be the best montage for this patient and this problem. So I know that Dr. Knott and Dr. Henry had a lot in common, but they all also had slightly different ways of bringing the questions to the tech and making you want to be involved in the process.
What were your earliest career influences?
ABRET was just getting started as I was a student. I think the first 12 had been examined at that point. But because Lila Snodgrass and John Knott were involved in the exam, we knew there was a registration board. We knew there would be exams if we were going to follow in the field. And I remember meeting as a student, or in my first year after being a student, people like Dorothea Brittenham, Theda Sanet, Nina Kagawa. You can't help but glean something from anybody who gets involved in the EEG lab. So I would say all of those people involved with ABRET probably affected how we were trained and their actual visits to the lab. They would either do a record review session or they would demonstrate something in the lab. I remember seeing paraffin-applied EEG electrodes. And sometimes things from way back in the past you may come back and visit again in a different setting. But having that depth and breadth of exposure just gives you a lot to draw on.
If you had not become an EEG technologist, what would you have done?
That's been an interesting question. And I would wonder that I might have gone into the arts. I might have gone into nursing. The medical field was my kind of chosen area to pursue as a lifetime of work. And my mother had been a nurse, but I think it was kind of finances that held me off from going into nursing initially. But if I hadn't done medical, I really don't know what I might have done. I like working with people. I like problem solving. There can be some routine, but there has to be some means of expression, of personal contribution to the tasks at hand. And I suppose there's lots of room for those capabilities in a variety of fields, but I'm happy I found EEG. I started EEG when I was 19. It's been a long time, and I work casual now at Vancouver General Hospital, and I still delight in doing patients. I delight in getting information in their history that maybe they've been reluctant to give elsewhere. I like getting people comfortable enough that the majority of my patients fall asleep naturally. I like having them relax in my presence because I've reassured them what we're doing and why we're doing it without violating any, without doing any diagnosing or without giving any restricted medical information. So some people just have never talked to somebody about their blackouts or their seizures, and to know that it's not a subject that I'm embarrassed about, they often feel comfortable discussing it, maybe for the first time. And I like that, and I like the mystery and problem-solving aspect. And I like to be proud of what I'm turning in, and hopefully I've contributed a little bit of myself in the process.
Why do you think this field took off when and how it did?
I think it took off because there was training. So there was a standardized level of technology that between board exams for physicians and board exams for techs, the two levels of expertise could be combined. If I can paraphrase something that Bill Irwin once said, and it truly is a paraphrase, I think it was back in the early days of registration and whether or not it was warranted to go through all the trouble to register, but he said, in essence, that the EEG or physician can't be any better than his technologist, i.e. if the techs weren't well trained, then the physicians didn't have the quality of data they needed to make further judgments. And so I think it was the training and the documentation of acquired knowledge that made EEG respectable, and people then could use the data, whether it be in the OR or ICU or other means of investigating things other than just seizures. And so I think it was education and documentation of education that were key to the field being more respected.
What equipment did you train on, and what were the limitations of it?
We had a wide variety of GRASS instrumentation at the University of Iowa. We had one Model 3, and it had been upgraded to have a power supply, although I did on one occasion get to work with a Model 3 with a car battery with a charger that you put on at night. And we had GRASS Model 6s in sizes from 8, 10, and 16 channel in the lab, and then at a nearby children's hospital they had a 12 channel Model 6, and then we eventually went to the Model 8. At the time, the limitation seemed to be number of channels. We had a single 16 channel, so we would look at the patients at a particular appointment time and pick the one we thought would be most complex, and we would assign, we would choose that the tech doing that patient would get the 16 channel, and then the rest of us would sort through the remaining machines. So at that point, I don't think I was sophisticated enough to see anything other than the number of recording channels. We definitely learned how to modify montages. So if you needed EKG, you put it in, and you put it in the area least likely to be missed in a montage. We didn't take a Model 3 on portables, but we took the other machines on portables. So at that point, I didn't even, there's a point you don't realize EEG machines can have smaller footprints and less weight because we did what we needed to with them. So I think at that point, I wasn't skilled enough to recognize the limitations. It's still kind of magic that machines can record brainwaves.
What other type of equipment have you used over the years, and could you summarize the pros and cons of each?
Well, the machines over the years, it's more a matter of machines in their time. I had brief experience with the 2-box Type T Beckman machine. I encountered that twice in my experience. That was supposed to be a portable machine you could actually take out of the building if you needed to. And I worked on the drafting board slanted surface of the Accutrace. They each had their pluses and minuses, and most of those don't exist anymore. They were analog machines. You could do monitoring. It was nice when the jack boxes got big enough. You had more than PG1 and PG2 to put extra electrodes in, so you could monitor EKG routinely, or you could put eye leads in more frequently. So enlarging the jack box was one of the first things of the old analog machines that I liked, as well as the additional channels. Master switches were nice, and master switches that actually changed the value instead of just being a multiplier, like on the early graphs machines. So you didn't have to recompute that, gee, -3 out of sensitivity 7 is really sensitivity 20. You could turn a master switch and it was identified by its actual value. I remember we were all impressed when the rapid roll-off filter came in, and then recognized on a grass machine we could get the same effect with a 60 hertz and a 35 combined. So the differences between machines were sometimes just different ways of combining pre-existing controls.
What memories do you have of your training program? And you've already talked a lot about a lot of good ones.
Well, there were a few little odd ones that we didn't have to learn, but we knew there were 31 positions of the great toe. Our anatomy and physiology were taught by grad students in those programs, and I don't know how that came up, but when we were at a gathering 10 and 15 years later, everybody remembers that there were 31 positions of the great toe. You can't get much farther away from the head than that, but that was one of those little quirky things. When we were studying sleep, we were a class, I don't know if we were still 8 at that point or not. We graduated 6, but one of the students would be the sleep patient for all night, and there would be 3 of us who would each do a 4-hour section of recording. And my roommate, Carol Hogue, at the time, recalls waking up in the morning saying, "Oh, I'm so sorry I didn't sleep last night," and she had dreamed that she had been awake all night and that Dr. Knott was going to be upset at her. The other thing regarding sleep recordings is the person who had the 12 to 4 o'clock session would sleep then in the lab rather than be walking home or driving home in the middle of the, middle of the night. And I remember I was that tech, so I slept in one of the labs, and then when the last person who had the 4 to 8 section finished the recording, cleaned up the patient. It was a male student, and he gave me a ride home, and I was carrying my roommate's pillow. So he dropped me off in front of my building at 8 o'clock in the morning. I'm looking quite sleep-deprived and tousled, and I'm carrying my own pillow walking back into the room. I always figured that might have raised an eyebrow or two.
What are the main ways in which you think the field has changed over the years? Well,
I think as a field we have a greater presence in operating rooms, whether it be brain surgery or spine or orthopedic surgery. So whether the recording is brain activity itself or evoked potential activity, we proved ourselves very useful. I know at Vancouver General, EEG recording is a standard of practice during carotid surgeries now, if there's any chance that they might need to make the decision of whether or not to shunt. So I think it's been the quality of the work that we do and the progression of things like evoked potentials that have allowed us to interact with other modalities.
And it kind of goes into this next question, which is how has scientific knowledge changed in the field, and what do you think were the big breakthroughs?
I think the big breakthrough is digital. So much has changed with that. I can remember kind of being oriented to good teaching samples of if you had an abnormal record, the only way to get a particular waveform on 3 different types of montages, or even 2 different, if you wanted AP, bipolar, and reference all on a single waveform, you had to create that montage while you were running the patient and have parts of those 3 montages in a single montage. Or if you wanted a good reference and a bad reference sample, you had to run it live, ink on the paper, because very few labs were set up to be recording brain waves in any fashion. So if you had a good example, you needed to create your sample on the fly. You couldn't come back to it later. So going digital has allowed any waveform to be looked at on any type of montage, limited only by the electrodes you had on the head at the time. That's both a good thing and a bad thing. There are people who use digital to its full extent, and then there are people who run the record exactly the way they would have on paper, not utilizing those techniques, or you have the reader who ignores the things the text may have done and reads it on the montages he wants to, which may be inopportune use of sensitivity or filters. So there's still individual uses of improved technology, and I think of course, the best situation is well-trained techs with well-trained EEGers, but you also have the other end where people without an appreciation of the quality of the field see it as a money-making endeavor and recruit someone to be trained in a very short period of time to put on electrodes and yield wiggly lines. And those are the weakness of the field, that can still exist.
What are the 2 to 3 big issues in EEG that people are working on to solve today?
Well, as a retired tech and not quite involved as much as I used to be in current discussions, I would say it's still raising the level of education and having it raising it and having it documented for both the physicians and the techs in the field. I know in the States there's often problems with reimbursement and being knowledgeable about that, I think, is important for techs. But I think the main issue is still education and continuing education, and I think ASSET has been very valuable in creating a system where techs can add to their education in a number of different ways, earning educational credits for attending meetings, also for kind of doing their homework by reading their journals and that sort of stuff, and making regional societies aware that they can present programs that contribute to continuing education credits, because those are things that exist in other specialties, and so they have a recognized value. And being a part of that added value system is very important.
What are the main areas of professional discussion or disagreement going on today?
I think I'd like to pass that question. I'm
Okay.
not got a really good answer for that.
And what are you most proud of in your professional life?
I think it would be the interaction with ABRET. I guess I'm proud to have been able to be a part of it, but ABRET also was a good learning experience for me. As just a bit of a backtrack, I was very fortunate to be taken on as a representative for Grass Instrument companies in the 70s. And I worked full-time at that point in Vermont and eventually moved to Boston and worked full-time. But I would go to meetings on their behalf and could talk to techs about technical things that didn't require electrical engineering conversation, because a lot of it was hands-on tech-to-tech conversations. But going to lots of meetings gave me lots of exposure and also let me interact with ABRET considerably more than I would have in the meetings I would have been able to attend on my own. Being a part of ABRET was being exposed to the brightest minds, both physician and tech, in North America, and working on the ABRET written exam and appreciating the care with which every question is so concisely and precisely worded, and how efforts are made to eliminate any possible miscommunication or misinterpretation of the question. So I would say being involved with ABRET is something I was very proud to have been chosen to do. And then 9 months aboard the USS Hope, which was a hospital ship, was really one of my adventures of a lifetime. It was indeed a hospital ship. It was reworked from the Korean War, and we were based in Kingston, Jamaica. I was an added staff because the original EEG tech who went down with the ship had died in a traffic accident shortly after their arrival. And I had a couple years earlier, applied to SS Hope, but hadn't completed adding all my letters of reference. But I was on their list of people who had shown an interest in them. And so I joined the ship Hope in Kingston Harbor, and we worked with the University of the West Indies that was in Kingston. One of the research projects was on ganja, which was the Jamaican name for marijuana. I wasn't personally involved in the recordings, but I helped the physicians who were involved in that project, and I trained 2 graduate nurses to do EEG. It was an incredible working relationship because the head of all the departments and the physicians who came on 1 or 2 month rotations from the States, plus the permanent staff, of which EEG techs, lab techs, and nurses were, was a good community of, there was never the idea, it's not in my job description. Your roommate may have been a pharmacist, and if you had to leave port because of bad weather, you went to pharmacy and helped put up barriers so that things didn't move on the shelves. Or you went over to X-ray and you helped them tie down the mobile parts of the X-ray equipment so that it was safe as we left harbor. So you learned a lot about different areas of medical experience, and I look back on that as one of my fondest memories. And I came from I grew up partly in Spokane, and then we moved to a farming community. And when I left high school, I would not have imagined being able to travel to Jamaica or to Marseille, France, where I was an invited lecturer. EEG just opened the world for me, and I'm forever grateful that kind of the circumstances just lined up the way they did.
Where do you see EEG in the next 10 years, in 10 years from now?
I wonder if it won't finally get to the point where techs are yielding reports. Maybe they're going to still be called technical descriptions, but there are so many areas where techs are exposed to working independently or almost independently that I can't help think with greater education and documentation of saying that there will be a higher level of reporting capabilities. And part of that is because I think there aren't enough physicians to support all the areas into which EEG can contribute. That's my own personal view, but I see and hear situations where techs are saying they're reporting to the surgeon, and if you're doing it orally, it's not much farther to be doing it in print. So I would think continued education, and I won't be surprised if there's more areas that are found to be have EEG as an added value technique.
What is the best piece of advice that you've ever received?
I think it's one of those life sort of messages, and it applies in EEG as it does in every life, and that would be to quote, treat people like you would like to be treated, end quote. And if you interact with patients that way, if you interact with your staff that way, if you interact with the person on the phone that way, you tend to get you get the same thing in response. So if you have a nervous patient, you be reassuring. If you have somebody who's angry, you ask how you can help. That often defuses them because they expect you to reflect back their anger or their anxiety, And if you can acknowledge what they're feeling and then carry on from there. On to things in my life in EEG. Michael wanted me to be sure and state that I met my husband at an EEG meeting. And it was one of my, it may have been my, if not my first, it was my first out of country, i.e. it was Winnipeg, Canada, where I met him. And it was, if not my first, one of my first times that I had represented Grass Instruments at an EEG meeting. So that shows the implication of being able to attend a lot of meetings. You meet lots of interesting people, and Michael, I definitely put among the most interesting.
I agree with that.
Well, thank you both.
in a really good way, in a very positive way. Okay, I'll turn off the recording, and then I'll just be right back.
Okay.